In 2007, a 44-year-old man walked into a hospital in France. He had a slight weakness in his left leg. Routine visit. Nothing alarming. But when the doctors ran a brain scan, they found something that made them stop and stare and question everything they had spent their careers believing. His skull was almost entirely filled with fluid. Where a brain should have been, there was almost nothing. And yet, he was standing right in front of them, married, employed, father of two, perfectly alive. The human brain is supposed to be the most complex object in the known universe. 100 billion neurons, 100 trillion connections. Scientists have spent centuries mapping every region, every function, every millimeter. They thought they understood it. This man proved they didn't. Welcome to Hidden Human, where the human body keeps secrets that science is only beginning to uncover. To understand what happened to this man, you need to understand one condition: hydrocephalus. It's sometimes called water on the brain, and the name is exactly what it sounds like. Cerebrospinal fluid, the liquid that normally cushions your brain, begins to build up inside the skull instead of draining away. Slowly, over years, sometimes over decades, the pressure increases, and the brain tissue, caught between the fluid and the skull, has nowhere to go. In most cases, hydrocephalus is catastrophic. It causes severe disability, cognitive damage, death. Most people with serious hydrocephalus don't survive infancy. Those who do are usually profoundly disabled. Usually. This man had been diagnosed with hydrocephalus as an infant. At 6 months old, doctors inserted a shunt into his head, a small tube designed to drain the excess fluid. It kept him alive. Then, at age 14, the shunt was removed, and for the next 30 years, the fluid came back, slowly, silently, completely. By the time he walked into that hospital at 44, 95% of the space inside his skull was fluid. His brain had been compressed into a thin sheet of tissue lining the inside of his skull, and he had absolutely no idea. When the doctors saw the scan, their first instinct was that it was wrong. Equipment error, mislabeled file, someone else's scan, because what they were looking at was not supposed to be possible. A normal brain scan shows dense gray tissue filling the entire skull. His scan showed an almost perfect black void, just a thin white ring around the edges where brain tissue clung to the inside of his skull. That was it. That was his brain. The doctors ran the tests again. Same result. They tested his cognitive function. His IQ came back at 75, slightly below average, but functional, aware, present. He knew his name, his children's names, his job, his address. He could hold a conversation. He could reason. He could feel. He could remember, with a brain that by every medical understanding should not have been able to do any of those things. This wasn't the first time something like this had been documented. In 1980, a neurologist named John Lorber was working at Sheffield University in England when a colleague sent him an unusual student. The student was there for a routine checkup. He had a slightly enlarged head. That was all. But when Lorber scanned him, he found the same impossible image, virtually no brain. The student's skull was 95% filled with fluid, and yet he had an IQ of 126, a first-class honors degree in mathematics, no symptoms, no disabilities, no indication that anything was wrong. Lorber published his findings in the journal Science, under a title that became one of the most debated questions in neuroscience. Is your brain really necessary? The scientific community did not take it well. Some called it impossible. Some called it fraud. But the scans were real. The student was real, and no one could explain it. Here is where the story stops being just medical and starts being philosophical. For over a century, neuroscience operated on one core assumption: consciousness, your sense of self, your awareness, your ability to think and feel and exist, is produced by specific regions of the brain. Damage those regions and consciousness disappears. Simple, mechanical, predictable. But the Frenchman had almost none of those regions. His cortex, the outer layer responsible for thought, language, memory, and perception, had been compressed to a fraction of its normal thickness. The regions scientists had spent decades identifying as essential to consciousness were barely there, and yet consciousness remained full, intact, unaware of its own impossibility. Cognitive psychologist Axel Cleermans of the Université Libre in Brussels studied this case extensively. His conclusion was striking. The remaining neurons, however few, had reorganized themselves, built new pathways, redistributed functions across whatever tissue remained. The brain had spent 30 years quietly, invisibly, adapting to its own destruction, not fighting it, adapting to it, which raises a question that neuroscience still cannot answer. If consciousness can survive with 5% of a brain, where exactly does consciousness live? John Lorber didn't stop at one case. Over his career, he systematically studied over 600 brain scans of people with hydrocephalus. He divided them into 4 groups based on how much of the skull was filled with fluid. In the most severe group, where fluid filled 95% or more of the skull, half were profoundly disabled, but the other half had IQs above 100, half functioning, thinking, living, with almost no brain by conventional measurement. This pattern, repeated across hundreds of cases, suggested something that neuroscience had never seriously considered: that the brain has a level of redundancy and adaptability so extreme it defies the maps we've drawn of it. That the relationship between brain tissue and human function is far looser, far stranger than anyone had imagined. What scientists still cannot explain, here is where science runs out of answers. We know what happened to these men. We can describe it. We can document it. We can scan it. What we cannot do is explain it. How does a brain compressed to 5% of its normal volume maintain full consciousness? How does it preserve personality, memory, language, emotion? How does it reorganize itself so completely that the person living inside it never once suspected anything was wrong? There are theories: neural plasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself; redundancy, the idea that many brain functions are duplicated across multiple regions; gradual adaptation, the slow redistribution of function over decades rather than sudden damage. But none of these theories fully account for what these men could do. A mathematics degree with virtually no brain, a family, a job, a life, with 95% fluid where gray matter should be. The most sophisticated imaging technology in the world looking at these scans and still not understanding what it's seeing. The brain, the organ we use to understand everything, remains the thing we understand least. And these men, without knowing it, without trying, proved that everything we thought we knew about the mind was only the surface. That man came into a hospital with a sore leg. He left with his life unchanged. Same job, same family, same sense of who he was. The only thing that had changed was that the doctors now knew something about him that he never needed to know about himself. His brain had been quietly doing the impossible for 44 years. No one noticed, not even him. That's not a malfunction. That's not a miracle. That's the hidden human. Subscribe. Because we've barely started.